sure we're streaming here. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back to another Holler Live interview. I'm Holler co-founder Justin Canoe, and I'm going to be joined here today by HANEY LOPEZ, who is going to teach us how to take our country back. So without further ado, let's
Pay
get
attention.
right to that. Ian, how are you, sir?
I'm doing really well. I'm delighted to join you.
Thank you for being here. I should say up front that the Tennessee Holler is a progressive news site. We are at tnholler.com and at the TN Holler on Twitter and Facebook, where theoretically we are right now streaming. And if you guys want to talk to us, that's great. Ian, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're in Berkeley, but can you just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm a professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley, and I have had a long time interest in racism. Are coming together as one people, as Americans. So there's always been this forward and backward. The last big advance was really during the civil rights movement during the 1950s and the 1960s, huge advance. That advance created anxiety among many whites in the South and then across the country. And the anxiety was, what would it mean to be in a society in which whites weren't simply assumed to be racially superior, in which there would be integration, in which people would have to get to know each other and go to school together across race lines. At that point, 1960s, early 1960s, political leaders have a choice to make. They can say to people, we are going to honor the ideals of this country. We are going to move towards racial integration and equality because we all are Americans. Or they could say to themselves and to the voting public, you're right to be afraid. You should be afraid. And in fact, you should be even more fearful, but then you should vote for me because I'm the only one who can protect you. And that's really how dog whistle politics gets started. It gets started as a strategy. Interestingly, one of the first people to do this is George Wallace in Alabama. George Wallace runs for governor of Alabama in 1958 as a racial moderate. He's endorsed by the NAACP. But in Alabama in 1958, there's so much fear and anxiety, Wallace ends up losing to a racial firebrand. And Wallace, the evening of his concession speech, he says to some of his cronies, and this is harsh language, but he says to his cronies, no other son of a bitch is ever going to out-nigger me again. Wow. And what he means by that is, hey, I might have been a racial moderate, but racial moderates aren't going to win in this state at this time. I'm going to be the worst racial reactionary you've ever seen. And that's how he runs for governor in 1962. That's how he wins. That's how he comes to stand in the schoolhouse door, literally in the University of Alabama, and say, segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. But at the same time, he knew that that language was really unpopular and was getting increasingly ridiculed and unacceptable. So very quickly, he switches to other language. He starts talking about states' rights in particular. Again, this is strategy. Wallace has made the strategic decision to race bait, and then he made the subsequent strategic decision to do so in language that allowed him the ability to deny that that's what he was doing. He could say, hey, this is about state relationships, when in fact everybody understood that states' rights was pretty much the same thing as saying segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. You could just pretend that it was about federal-state relations rather than racism.
So I'm going to play a clip right now that sort of demonstrates what you're talking about, and this is one that I know that you've played also.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say it because that hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than white. We want to cut this, and we want it's much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger.
So the bottom line is what we're seeing with all the states' rights talk and the let's cut things talk, it's actually just coded racism. And at the core of everything is racial division. And so what I would ask you is, if you were talking to a candidate today, how would you tell them to combat that? What are the things that you tell people who are trying to run for office that they should be saying? Because I know that it's not you're a racist. It's right. More complex than that.
Right. So that's a great clip from Lee Atwater. And what Lee Atwater is talking about is the way in which the language has evolved from blatantly racist language to things like states' rights and forced busing, welfare queen, illegal immigrant. But it also evolved to say, hey, we need to cut taxes. We need to cut services. And really, if you think about that, that's the key here. What you're seeing is that dog whistle politics is not just a way to mobilize racial fear, but it's a way to communicate a substantive message about government. And the message about government is, hey, you can't trust it. Government, when it does things like provide welfare or job training or public education or, frankly, healthcare, government's really actually giving that stuff away to undeserving people of color, illegal immigrants, refugees. Reject government efforts to create programs that help people because they're not really helping people. They're helping undeserving people. When people accept that, they end up turning their backs on government. They end up losing access to those services themselves. And they end up supporting a system of government in which government essentially is run by and for the benefit of the rich. That's a key insight. What we're getting out of dog whistle politics is both racial resentment and hatred of activist government that actually works for working people. That provides a really important way for politicians to message around where we are today in 2019. The goal isn't simply to fight racism. The goal is to fight racial division in the way it's been weaponized against all of us, so that it ends up being the plutocrats who are running the country. And that's a message that can bring all of us together, right? So, we all need to fight racial division. We all need to build cross-racial solidarity to take care of our own families, whether we're black or brown, but whether we're white too. And this is the key that I think many people have really struggled to recognize. But if you think about the biggest danger to white families today, it's the way in which anti-black and anti-brown racism suffuses our politics. When people vote in terms of fear of black and brown people, they're electing politicians who are actually serving the interests of the very rich and screwing all the rest of us. So when white families are thinking about what's happened to their pensions and why is healthcare so difficult to get and why can't they get a living wage and what happened to the unions, the short answer is too many people have been voting their racial fears and supporting politicians who racially divide us, but who are actually in the pockets of the billionaire class.
And what do you say to somebody who just thinks, that's all fine and good, but maybe people are just racist? And, how do we reach out essentially through our language to show, because I believe what you're saying. I just ran for Congress in 2018. I ran for the seat that Marsha Blackburn left behind. And I believe that we have more in common than we realize. I believe that working white men and women and working black and brown men and women have a lot more in common than wealthy people and people of any color that aren't wealthy. I think that the shared lived experience is very real. But I also wonder, how deep-seated is the myth that they've planted to create this boogeyman of people of color that people will blame forever? It's not easy to convince them, what the real, not for lack of a better word, enemy here is the oligarchy and the ruling class that really just wants as much as they can keep for themselves. How do we combat the actual racism?
I think so. So I think that there's two audiences here. I think there's a white audience, and for the white audience, the message is, hey, you think that racism is something that is a problem for people of color. You don't think it's a big deal. You know, if you're well-meaning, you figure you're against racism and you'll deal with racial justice later, but you got other stuff to focus on. And what you don't realize is racism is the biggest threat in your own life, because racial resentment, racial anxiety and anger and acrimony, that is the single biggest, most powerful, most effective weapon that the ruling class have used against us for the last 50 years. And if you don't believe it, take a look at Donald Trump. That's what Donald Trump embodies, right? And so this is a message that says to white folks, get in the fight against racism. This is not just about doing the right thing. This is about saving your own families, right? But now that message then has to be translated to communities of color. And what's happening with communities of color is communities of color have heard messages of cross-racial solidarity over and over and over again. And traditionally, what those messages have meant has been, we need to come together. Race divides us, so let's ignore race. Don't focus on race. Focus on the things that bring us together. And that message doesn't work with communities of color, because we know that our issues have been consistently shunted aside. You know, that's just another way of saying wait. And it's frankly, that message isn't going to work anymore. So it's very important to recognize that this race-class fusion is not a sort of a colorblind, traditional focus on class because class alone will bring us together. This is race-class that says we really are divided by race. We really do have to do hard work to deal with racial division. You know, this stuff, the racism is real. We've internalized it. We've grown up with it. It handicaps our thinking. It poisons us. But we are going to have to deal with it, and we all have to deal with it. White folks have to deal with it to save their families, and people of color have to deal with their own sorts of garbage that they've inherited, and they've also got to create room for a multiracial movement, right? And so this is a very much a move that says this isn't going to be easy, because this is not going to be colorblind. This is going to be an anti-racist, race-conscious class movement. And that's very different from most class movements. A lot of class movements, frankly, most class movements are like, we are the 99%, therefore let's not talk about race. Not going to happen. You're not going to build a powerful progressive movement that way. This is an anti-racist class movement. This is a movement of the 99% that says the way we build a genuine progressive 99% is we deal with the things that are dividing us. And the number one thing that's dividing us is racism. We're also going to have to deal with sexism and patriarchy, religious bigotry. We're going to have to deal with those things. And the reason we're going to deal with them is it's the right thing to do, but also it's the only way we're going to win on any issue at all, whether it's economic populism or the Green New Deal or ending mass incarceration, police violence. Every issue that progressives care about require that we do the hard work of building a genuinely egalitarian multiracial movement.
Do you see the presidential candidates using this kind of language? Like, who do you think is actually putting this into action right now? It seems like a lot of them kind of are doing this.
I don't think a lot of them are doing this, and I think only some of them can do this. This race class message is a radical message, but it's a radical message in the same way that America is a radical experiment. This is a message that says government should be by and for all of us. The economy should be by and for all of us. The point is a society that gives each of us the best possible opportunity to thrive. That's the liberty component. A society in which we're recognized as equals, right? That's the equality component. This sort of a message requires candidates who are serious about fundamental change in how our economies run, and requires candidates who are serious about fundamental change in terms of racial justice, in terms of ending mass incarceration, ending mass deportation, real sovereignty for Native Americans. You need candidates who are willing to say to the American public, we've lost our way, the system's not working, we are going to fundamentally change the system, and that's the best way to honor the American promise. That's the best way to achieve what's exceptional about America. I think there's a set of candidates who are simply not willing to say that. I think there's a set of candidates, frankly, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, their position seems to be all we need to do is defeat Trump and we'll get back to normal. It's like, no. Pre-Trump wasn't normal. Pre-Trump was already deep racial division, surging wealth inequality. We need candidates who are willing to move us forward on both of those dimensions. In terms of people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, I hear them saying, yes, we're going to move forward on these fundamental issues. What I want to hear more from them is a clear explanation that these aren't separate issues and that we should just do both. Rather, I want them to say, we're going to move forward on both because both are already linked. Race and class are already linked because racism is the primary weapon in the class war the rich are winning. And if we want to make progress on any front, we're going to tackle both of them together.
I think that's really poignant. And, you know, one of the things, first of all, I want to let people know that you actually went through a process of studying this. You focus grouped it. You ran a whole experiment where you had people's hands on a knob and they were responding to messaging. And what you found was that this actually worked. This isn't just you in a room guessing. This is actually, you went out and focus grouped it and did the work to figure this out. And that's a really important point to make because a lot of people have thoughts, but not a lot of people go out and actually run the experiment. So, you know, one of the things that I like that I'd like you to elaborate on a little bit that you said was that some of the quote unquote solutions that Democrats propose are being proposed on Republican terms, where, for example, when Pelosi rejects the idea of a wall but says, but also will give you billions for border security, she's sort of accepting as inherent the idea that there is a threat at the border and that brown people are scary. And, you're essentially saying something that I think Beto O'Rourke was actually doing a lot of, which is rejecting the notion that there's a crisis, rejecting the notion that this is a threat, and essentially saying, we need to embrace the idea of immigration, embrace the idea of a changing populace, and focus more on, togetherness and moving forward together. Is that about right? That Beto sort of had it right?
That's completely right. Let me back up and say, look, we started out this conversation by saying, hey, when did this start? This starts with Southern Democrats, actually in the 1960s. It's very quickly picked up by the Republicans. It's picked up by Richard Nixon. Democrats know as early as 1970 that race is going to be used as a wedge issue to pull apart the New Deal coalition of the white working class, African Americans, and white liberals. So since 1970, they've had 50 plus years to figure out, hey, how are you going to respond? What are you going to do to fight back? Their first intuition was, let's call these people racist. Let's just say, we know that this is just racism. We're just going to call it racist. But what they quickly recognized is calling people who are dog whistling racist, saying, hey, Trump's a white supremacist, for example, that actually helps Trump, right? Because Trump's basic message is we are a country locked into racial conflict and everybody needs to choose a racial team. When you get progressives saying Trump's a racist and Trump turning around and saying you're a racist for calling me a racist, that's precisely the racial conflict that Trump is talking about, right? So Democrats pretty quickly figured out, hey, we can't call him racist. So they said, well, we can't challenge it directly. Maybe we'll stay silent on this. But staying silent didn't work either. And you can see very quickly why not, right? If the Republicans are saying people of color are welfare queens, people of color are super predators, they're undeserving, they're threatening, and Democrats are saying, hey, let's ignore all of that and let's focus on what we can do for job creation. It just doesn't cut it. If people are animated by these intense racial fears, that's what's got their imagination going. So Democrats had to figure out some way to respond. Bill Clinton figured out a way to respond, but unfortunately it was a if you can't beat them, join them sort of response. Bill Clinton himself started talking about how Democrats would crack down on crime and Democrats would end welfare as a way of life. He essentially picked up the Republican dog whistle themes. Today in 2019, most Democrats are thinking that we face the same array of choices in how to respond to Donald Trump. And it's not just Donald Trump, we should be clear. It's just about every Republican candidate out there is campaigning on the basis of a racial threat narrative that says you need to fear Sharia law, you need to fear immigrants, you need to fear illegal aliens, you need to close down refugees, black cities are out of control, right? That's the main rhetoric coming from just about every Republican candidate. And Democrats are stuck saying to themselves, we can call them racist, we can ignore it, or we can do a version of imitation in which we say, well, we won't be as extreme as you, but we too will promise to keep you safe from dangerous people of color, and we too will make sure that we don't give anything to undeserving people of color. And you see that, for example, when Nancy Pelosi says, well, we won't fund a wall, but we will provide billions in border security, right? It's that same sort of, hey, we'll keep you safe too. And the point is to pivot and to recognize you can challenge dog whistle politics directly. You can challenge racial division directly, not as white racism against people of color, but in terms of racism as a class weapon that hurts all of us. And when you challenge the racial division that way, what that allows you to say is, all the violence on the border, Trump putting the military on the border, That's part of the big con. Trump wants to campaign and he wants to govern in a way that pretends the real danger we face is from refugees, from caravans, from invasion. But just step back for a minute. These are people who are fleeing for their lives, who are running, who are leaving behind family and their language and everything they know to try and save their children. Are they really the threat? Or isn't the much greater threat are political leaders who intentionally stoke hatred and division among all of us so that they can rig the rules for the billionaire class and dynastic wealth and the big corporations, big tech, and big ag industry, right? We can turn away, we can name the narrative of a threat as the con. The con is fear people of color. They're who threaten you. But the truth is, we're all in this together. And when we come together, that's the only time we'll have the political power to fight the real threat, which is coming from leaders who intentionally divide us so they can rig the rules for the plutocrats.
Right. And so that is the lesson. The lesson is, you know, we need to realize who actually is benefiting from what's going on. And one of the challenges is, you know, when I ran for Congress, I ran in a very red district, and there's sort of a paradox where people in those areas in the rural parts of the state, they say, well, the government never did anything for me. But then if you say, okay, well, how about healthcare? How about, you know, higher wages? How about a federal jobs guarantee, whatever? Then they say, no, keep government out of this. So on the one hand, they don't think the government did anything for them, even though in a lot of cases they're on Medicare and they're on Social Security and things that actually are helping them. And on the other hand, they've bought the pill, which is that, you know, anything the government touches is bad for them, when,
right.
You know, there's a laundry list of things that the government has done to make their lives better. But this is something that you touched on, and it's something that also Nancy McLean touches on in her book, Democracy in Chains, which is, you know, their game is to essentially make government seem like the bad guy because they don't want to pay for anything.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And them having to pay for things involuntarily that don't benefit them is sort of their entire goal, is to shrink government. Because what is government? Government is, you know, a mechanism to actually help people, but they don't need that because they've got all the help they need.
The they being the 0.1% and the corporations, and that's really important. So listen, there was a period in the United States, we call it the Long New Deal, in which we saw the largest expansion of the middle class that in the United States history, but frankly in the history of the entire world. This was the biggest expansion of the middle class ever. How was it achieved? It was achieved by government committing to work for working families rather than for corporations. And what that meant was high taxation on big fortunes and on corporations, then government turning around and pushing that wealth downward and outward through programs like education and a social safety net and investment in infrastructure and support for unions that created ladders of upward mobility. And the real question is, why did so many Americans turn against government when government was so important to creating this big expansion of the middle class? And the answer to that question, more than anything else, was the power of this racist rhetoric that said, oh, government, you thought it was helping regular people, but in fact, it's helping undeserving minorities, it's helping welfare queens. Hate government. And the challenge in 2019 is for progressives to say to folks, you know that hate government rhetoric? That's the rhetoric of the rich. They don't need government help. They would rather hoard all of their wealth for themselves and screw the rest of us. But we need government. All of us, the 99%, need government to make sure that government is working for us and not for the 0.1%. And the only way we're going to get back to making sure government works for us is by seeing that this idea that government just helps undeserving people is a lie. It's a lie that dehumanizes people of color and it impoverishes the whole country. And that's the move, to say to folks, you think government's your enemy, and maybe when government works for the rich, or when government is, over policing, that's bad. But don't give up on government as a whole. Hold government to what it should be. Government should be an engine of upward mobility, an engine towards full humanity for every one of us. That's what we're demanding. And if people say you can't have it because that's going to be giveaways to poor people of color, just say, what are you talking about? Everybody, whether they're white, black, or brown, deserves an opportunity to thrive. And once we recognize that, we actually have the power to make sure that we can make that come true.
Well, government's either it's working no matter what. It's not going away. So we might as well make sure it's working in our favor. And, I think the message that you're pushing is a really important one, especially in states like ours where, we're trying to overcome long odds. We don't vote the way we should. And I think people are generally disillusioned with the process. But, to have a sort of an exciting progressive message where people are reaching out across color lines and saying, no, this has to work for everybody and we're all in this thing together is really important. And I think you're right to take on these issues of racism head on.
Yeah.
I just flashed one of your tweets, which I just wanted to post here real quick. It says the most powerful weapon of the rich in the class war they are winning is racism. I think that's spot on. And then I'm also going to flash your book here. It's called Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections, and Saving America. Ian, thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate you coming on here. And if you have any final thoughts, I don't want to keep you forever. So if you have any final thoughts just as we sign off here, I'd love to hear it, especially since, we're here in Tennessee and we need a message like this when we have a lot of exciting young candidates that are taking on long odds to run in extremely conservative districts.
Yeah, let me just end. I actually have a couple of thoughts I'd love to end with. One is, we need to get off of this thing of thinking that racism is just one thing, that is personal hatred, and that racists are just one thing, that they're the kind of people who wear Klan hoods. That's just not right. And there's bad news, but also good news here. If you were born and raised in the United States, you've ended up absorbing a lot of racist bullshit. You just have. I have. You have, we all have. That's the bad news. If you were raised here on American culture, American TV, living in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our churches, you ended up internalizing a lot of stereotypes. That's the bad news. But here's the good news. The vast majority of us, 85% of us, also simultaneously believe in racial equality, believe racism is wrong, believe we should get together across race lines. We are complex. We are complicated people. We can be both poisoned by internalized racism and also deep believers in racial egalitarianism, racial equality. And that's very important to hold on to, because I think that there's a way in which we want to condemn other people for being racist in a way that we're like, we just reject them. We don't want anything to do with them. And that both alienates them, but also isn't honest about the work that we ourselves have to do. So I want to be realistic. I want to say, racism, we all have to deal with it, but we can deal with it because almost every one of us also believes it's a great moral wrong and we should get past it. So that's the first point I want to end on. Here's the last point. Dealing with racism is the way we make this country what it was supposed to be. We are founded on radical ideas of liberty and equality. And liberty and equality have to mean, at a minimum, that government will not be involved in systematic violence against certain communities because of their race. No more mass incarceration. No more mass deportation. In fact, government should attempt to systematically repair the harms that have been done for decades and centuries on the basis of racist thinking. That's one. And two, government buy-in for all of us really means that government should give all of us the best opportunity to thrive economically. It needs to run the economy and society in a way that helps all of us. That was the promise. That's what got the American Revolution going. Our progress towards that revolution has been halting. It has sometimes reversed, but overall it has been steady. And 2019, I think, is the year in which we recommit to that radical promise and to say, you know what's been holding us back? The shackles of race hatred. But if we can defeat race hatred, we can come back to the ideals of a country by and for all of us, out of many, one, liberty and equality for all of us, and make that meaningful. So they're not just platitudes, it's not just stuff on a dollar bill, but it's really the way we live and the way we organize our society. And it's the basis for hope for our own children and our families.
That's really well said, Ian. I think that's a great note to end on. It's inspiring, and I definitely hope people go out and get your book, Merge Left, and really internalize it, because the message of this race class narrative is one that I know a lot of people who are doing really good work here in Tennessee are picking up on. I was actually at a seminar where they talked about this. And so, the work you're doing is actually having an effect and an impact. And I think you know that, but I want to make sure that you do. And hopefully, as things progress, we can maybe jump on here and do it again down the line.
Would love to, Justin. I really appreciate your help helping to spread the word and all the great work you're doing, spreading progressive ideas in Tennessee. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. It's Merge Left, and thank you for being with us here today.